The desert wind carried a sound that didn't belong. Not the rustle of mesquite or the creak of dry wood, but something sharper, something human. Luke Thompson reined in his horse, rusty, squinting into the white glare of the Arizona morning. There, under the gnarled arms of an old oak, was a sight that made his stomach tighten. A young Apache woman, bound to the trunk, her wrists raw and bleeding, a strip of crimson cloth with a black raven feather pinned above her heart, a mark he'd heard whispered about in saloons, a sign of banishment or a curse. Carved into the bark beside her were the words, etched in shaky English, "God sends trials to the lost." The land stretched out for miles, a harsh, endless quilt of sand and scrub. This was the Arizona Territory, 1887, a year of broken treaties and restless tribes, when the memory of Geronimo's surrender still haunted the frontier. Luke had carved out a lonely life here, raising cattle on the edge of the Dragoon Mountains. 49 years had carved their mark on him, too. His hair was touched by gray, his skin burned by years of sun and sorrow. Since his wife and daughter died in a fever 5 winters ago, silence had been his only companion. Luke dismounted slowly, boots crunching over gravel. The girl's eyes, wide and dark like polished obsidian, fluttered open as he approached. She didn't speak. Her breathing was shallow, every inhale a struggle. The desert dust clung to her face like ash, and the raven feather trembled in the breeze. Luke had seen many things in this land-raided camps. Hanged men, but this? A girl left like a message or a warning? He stood there longer than he should have, hand resting on the handle of his Bowie knife. He could walk away. It wasn't his fight. In these territories, getting tangled in someone else's war often meant death. Not your business. The voice of his old self whispered the man who had buried too many memories to care. But as Rusty pawed at the dirt, the girl's head dropped forward, too weak to hold itself up, and something inside Luke stirred a memory of his daughter, reaching for his hand on her last day. With a deep, weary breath, he cut through the ropes. They fell to the ground like dead snakes, and the girl collapsed against him. She was so light, like the desert wind could carry her away. Luke glanced at the carved words on the tree. God sends trials to the lost. He wasn't sure if they were meant for the girl or for him. Either way, he knew this act would bring trouble, the kind that didn't just pass with the wind. Without a word, Luke lifted the girl onto Rusty, settling her in front of him. He adjusted his wide-brimmed hat, scanning the horizon where vultures circled in lazy spirals. The land felt watchful, like eyes were hidden in the sagebrush. As they rode toward his small ranch, Luke kept his silence. He was a man of few words, shaped by war, loss, and the loneliness of the open plains. The creak of the saddle, the soft grunt of Rusty's hooves, and the hiss of the wind were all the company he needed. But now, every sound felt sharper, more alive, because of the fragile weight of the girl leaning against him. The trail wound past dry creek beds and the remnants of old camps. He thought about the feather, the blood-red cloth, the story it told without words. He'd heard of such marks among the Apache signs of betrayal, of shame, or sometimes a punishment meant to outlast death itself. Who was she? And why had someone left her there, halfway between life and death? As the cabin came into view, a weathered structure of pine logs, smelling faintly of smoke and horse sweat, Luke felt the old walls of his solitude shift. He wasn't a man who believed in signs anymore, not since the fever took his family. But something about that carving on the tree stuck with him, like a splinter in the heart. God sends trials to the lost. And in that moment, he couldn't tell if it meant the girl or himself. The girl stirred as Luke carried her inside. His cabin was a simple 2-room shelter of rough-hewn pine, smelling of old coffee, dust, and wood smoke. He laid her down on the narrow cot, its wool blanket scratchy but warm, and stepped back for a moment, unsure what to do next. It had been years since he'd cared for another soul. His world was fences, cattle, and silence anon of which prepared him for the fragile life now trembling before him. He set aside his hat and coat, then knelt beside the cot, pulling a clean cloth from a basin. The girl's wrists were swollen, the rope burns raw and angry. As he dabbed them with cool water, she flinched but did not speak. Her dark eyes followed every movement, not with fear exactly, but with the wary patience of someone who had learned not to expect kindness. Luke warmed a tin cup of water over the fire and tilted it toward her lips. She drank slowly, each swallow a visible effort. He broke a piece of hardtack, softened it in the water, and offered it to her. She took it without a word, her hands shaking. He noticed the way she glanced at his revolver on the table, and without thinking, he slid it farther out of sight. Then he unbuckled the hunting knife from his belt and placed it on the shelf. Small gestures meant to tell her she wasn't a prisoner here. The fire crackled, casting orange light across the cabin walls. Outside, the wind sighed through the pines, carrying with it the distant howl of a coyote. Luke pulled an old wool coat around her shoulders and stepped back, leaning against the doorframe as if unsure how close he should be. Her face, bruised and pale beneath the desert dust, stirred a memory he'd tried to bury. His daughter, Mary, used to sit by this very hearth, her hands wrapped around a mug of milk, eyes bright with laughter. Fever had taken her so quickly one night, burning like fire, and by dawn, cold as the wind. His wife followed soon after, and the house had grown quieter than the grave. Luke glanced at the corner of the room where Sarah's old Bible rested. Its leather cover was worn, its pages marked by 100 tiny notes in her neat handwriting. He remembered her voice reading aloud at night, the verse that had once given him courage during the war. God is our refuge and strength, a very present help in trouble. Psalm 40, Now, looking at the girl, he wasn't sure if God was testing him or mocking him. On the girl's chest, the necklace caught the firelight again. It wasn't just jewelry, it was carved from bone and etched with the figure of white-painted woman, the mother spirit of the Apache people. Luke knew enough to understand that this symbol carried weight, faith, tradition, maybe even judgment. Whoever left her tied to that tree had done it with purpose. Maybe they meant her to die there as a warning. Maybe they were still out there, watching. The thought made Luke's jaw tighten. He'd spent years avoiding other people's battles, but something told him this wasn't a storm he could step around. He turned back to the girl, who stared at him with quiet strength, as though daring him to ask the question. "Who's after you?" he muttered, more to himself than to her. She didn't answer. As the firelight flickered across her face, Luke's mind churned. He could feel trouble brewing on the horizon, like a summer storm waiting to break. Who had bound her to that tree? And what did they think she had seen that made her dangerous enough to leave for dead? Before we dive into everything, let us know in the comments, where are you watching this video from? Connecting with viewers from all across the world has been a huge source of inspiration for us. The morning broke pale and silent. Luke stepped outside, letting the chill air wash over him. The horizon glowed faintly orange where the sun nudged its way past the mountains. Inside, the Apache girl still slept, her breath shallow but steadier than the night before. He filled a tin bucket at the rain barrel, washed his hands, and stared at the reflection of his own face in the waterline, tired and somehow different. It had been years since he'd felt the weight of another life depending on him. When he stepped back inside, she was awake. Her dark eyes studied him with a sharpness that unsettled him. She didn't speak. But when he offered her water, she nodded, sipping slowly as though testing whether the act of kindness was real. Her wrist, bandaged in a strip of his old shirt, trembled as she held the cup. Luke busied himself with small chores. His back turned to her. He stirred beans over the stove, checked the firewood, and tried not to notice how the cabin felt different, no longer just his. He could feel her gaze following him like a shadow. Around midday, Luke saddled Rusty and rode out along the fence line, needing to clear his head. The sky was a flawless blue, but the land carried whispers of unrest. Near the ridge, he spotted dust rising in the distance too far to make out figures, but enough to stir caution in his gut. When he returned, the girl was standing by the window, holding on to the edge of the table for balance. She pointed toward the ridge, her expression grave. "Riders," she said, her voice hoarse and accented but steady. It was the first word she had spoken to him. Luke stiffened. "You saw them too?" She nodded. That was when he knew trouble wasn't far behind her. He moved quickly, checking his rifle, making sure the ammunition box was full. He wasn't a man who looked for fights, but he'd survived enough winters and border raids to know the sound of danger. "You got a name?" he asked as he worked. After a pause, she said softly, "Nayeli." It sounded like the desert wind name, both fragile and strong. Luke stopped for a moment, the weight of her presence settling into his mind. "Well, Nayeli," he muttered, "looks like you brought company." She didn't answer, just met his gaze with those unyielding dark eyes. He saw fear there, yes, but also something else, resolve. That night, by the fire, Nayeli spoke again, her voice quiet but urgent. "They will come. Not soldiers, not lawmen, men who kill for money." Luke frowned. "Bounty hunters?" She nodded. She didn't elaborate, but her tone told him enough. Whatever she had seen or carried with her, these men wanted her gone, erased, like footprints after a storm. Later, when she slept, Luke sat by the table, staring at Sarah's old Bible. His wife had always believed God placed people in our path for a reason, even when the reasons hurt. "Lord," he muttered under his breath, "if this is your doing, I hope you know what you're asking of me." Outside, Rusty shifted uneasily in the corral, ears flicking. The night air carried a distant sound, faint but unmistakable, the drumbeat of hooves far off in the dark. The next day, Luke kept close watch on the horizon. He'd spotted dust trails again, faint but deliberate territories tracking someone, and he was sure it wasn't cattle they were after. By afternoon, he returned to the cabin, bolting the door behind him. Nayeli sat on the cot, shoulders straight, her necklace glinting in the firelight. She looked less fragile today, but her silence carried weight. Luke poured 2 cups of coffee, sliding one across the table toward her. "You're not just some girl lost in the desert, are you?" he said quietly. Her dark eyes flicked to his face, as if measuring him. Then, with a breath, she began to speak. "They call it Skeleton Canyon," she whispered, her voice raw but steady. "I was there when the shooting started." Luke froze. Skeleton Canyon wasn't just a name. It was the site of blood-soaked Taliesin ambush, a clash between soldiers and Apache bands, a place where treaties were broken and lives shattered. Luke remembered hearing the rumors in town, a so-called peace meeting gone wrong, leaving bodies in the dust. Nayeli's hands trembled as she gripped her necklace. "A white officer came to talk with my people," she continued. "He spoke of peace, of trading, of building a future together. But it was a lie. When our warriors laid down their weapons to talk, they were surrounded. The soldiers fired first. Men, women. They didn't spare anyone." Luke's jaw tightened. He'd seen enough war to know that the truth was often uglier than the stories told afterward. "Why are they after you?" Luke asked. Her gaze didn't waver. "Because I saw their faces. The men who rode with the soldiers. Some weren't soldiers. They were bounty hunters, hired to clean up the frontier, to drive fear into my people. They think if I die, the truth dies with me." Luke leaned back, the chair creaking under his weight. A silence stretched between them, heavy as the desert heat. "You're saying these bounty hunters aren't just chasing you for money. They're erasing witnesses." She nodded. "They don't want justice. They want silence." The revelation hit Luke harder than he expected. He had fought in the Union Army years ago, believing in honor and freedom, but the war had taught him how easily those words could rot. Now, looking at Nayeli, he felt a cold anger stir inside. If her story was true and he believed it was then hiding her, wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about doing what was right. Still, the practical side of him rebelled. "If these men know you're here, they'll come for me too," he muttered, half to himself. "And I'm no lawman." But Sarah's voice seemed to echo in his memory. "The Lord doesn't ask if you're ready. He asks if you're willing." From her satchel, Nayeli drew a small objecta, silver star, dented and stained. Luke recognized it instantly. A U.S. cavalry badge. She placed it on the table, her fingers curling back like it burned her. "This belonged to the officer who started the fire," she said. "I took it when he fell. It's proof of what they did." Luke stared at the badge, the weight of it sinking into him like lead. If anyone found her with that piece of metal, she'd be hunted to the ends of the territory. That night, as the wind howled outside, Luke couldn't sleep. He sat by the fire, the badge in his palm, praying for guidance. "Lord," he whispered, "if this girl's life is in my hands, show me what to do before it's too late." The next morning broke under a pale sun, and with it came a stillness that didn't feel right. Luke stood on the porch, his Winchester rifle cradled against his arm, scanning the horizon. The faint plume of dust he'd seen yesterday was closer now. It moved with purpose, too steady for wandering travelers, too slow for cavalry. He'd seen that pattern before, men tracking someone. Inside, Nayeli sat by the hearth, sharpening a small bone knife. Her hands were steady, her face unreadable, but her dark eyes shifted toward the door when she noticed Luke's tension. "They are near," she said softly, as though reading his thoughts. Luke didn't reply. He went to the barn, checking Rusty's saddle and tightening the reins. His mind was already racing if the bounty hunters came this way. His ranch was a trap, open on all sides but boxed in by hills. There was nowhere to run that they couldn't follow. By late afternoon, the first signs of trouble appeared. 3 riders crested the ridge to the north. Their silhouettes were sharp against the fiery sky-wide brimmed hats, rifles slung across their backs, and a pack mule trailing behind. One of them waved lazily when he spotted the cabin. It wasn't a friendly wave. Luke stepped off the porch, rifle in hand, but angled down. He didn't aim, not yet. The men reined their horses a short distance from the corral. The leader, a man with a thick mustache and the swagger of someone who enjoyed violence, called out, "Afternoon, friend. We're looking for a runaway. Apache girl. Might have passed this way." Luke said nothing for a moment. He could feel Nayeli's presence behind the door, her breath held. "Just me and my horse out here," he finally replied, his voice even but cool. The man smiled in a way that didn't reach his eyes. "Funny thing, we found tracks not far from here. Small feet, bare toes. Could belong to the one we're after." He leaned forward in his saddle. "If you've seen her, best you tell us now. Wouldn't want trouble to come knocking, would we?" Luke's fingers tightened on the Winchester stock. He wasn't a man who sought fights, but he'd learned long ago that predators could smell hesitation. "You'll find nothing but dust here," he said flatly. The second rider, a wiry man with a scar across his jaw, shifted in his saddle. "We're not asking for much, old man. Just a peek in that cabin of yours. Ain't like you got anything to hide." Luke stepped forward, blocking their view of the door. "Nobody steps into my home uninvited." His voice carried a tone that brooked no argument. The silence that followed was tense, stretching like a rope ready to snap. The leader chuckled, but there was no humor in it. "You got grit, I'll give you that. But grit won't stop a bullet. We'll be back by sunrise, and when we come, we won't be asking polite." The riders turned and trotted off, disappearing over the ridge, but Luke knew they'd be back. He exhaled slowly, the rifle still in his hands. Inside, Nayeli stood by the window, her expression hard. "They know," she whispered. Luke nodded. "Then we don't wait for them to knock." He began checking the shutters, securing the doors, and counting his ammunition. Every sound of preparation echoed through the cabin like a drumbeat. That night, as the fire burned low, he sat across from Nayeli, the rifle leaning against the wall. "If they come for you," he said quietly, "they'll have to come through me first." The cabin grew silent after the riders left, but it wasn't a peaceful silence. It was the tense, waiting the silence of predators circling in the dark. Luke sat at the edge of the table, sharpening his Bowie knife, though he wasn't sure if the sound of the steel on stone calmed him or made him more restless. He kept glancing toward the door, as though expecting it to burst open. Nayeli watched him quietly. She had wrapped her blanket around her shoulders, but her posture was straight, her eyes clear. "They will come at dawn," she said, her voice calm, as if stating a simple fact, not a threat. Luke grunted. "Then we'll be ready." Ah. But deep inside, he knew readiness wasn't the issue. It was why he was ready. For years, he had avoided other people's battles. Now, for reasons he didn't fully understand, he was willing to fight for this girl, a stranger, a reminder of everything he'd lost. When he glanced at her necklace again, his mind drifted to the war his time with the Union Army. He'd seen villages burned, families broken. Once, he'd helped bury a young Apache boy who had been shot simply for being in the wrong place. It was Sarah who told him afterward, "A man who can't protect the innocent loses a piece of his soul." Luke sighed and rubbed the scar on his left hand, a wound from those days. "Guess I still have something left to lose," he murmured under his breath. As night deepened, Nayeli moved closer to the fire. "You do not know this land like I do," she said softly, breaking the long silence. "If they come at dawn, we must use the desert to our advantage." Luke raised an eyebrow. "You got something in mind?" She nodded. "There is a dry arroyo 1/2 mile west. The walls are narrow, easy to defend, hard for men on horseback to surround." Luke considered this. He knew the arroyo, but he'd never thought of it as anything but a dry scar on the land. "You sure you can make it?" he asked, glancing at her still healing wrists. Her lips curved slightly, almost like a smile. "I have survived worse." Before dawn, Nayeli insisted they step outside. The stars were still bright above, the air cool and sharp. She crouched by a mesquite bush and started digging with a flat stone. Moments later, water seeped from the ground, a trick Luke had never seen. "You see the leaves?" she explained, pointing to the bush's thin, pale stems. "It drinks from water below. Follow the right plants, and the desert will not kill you." Luke watched, impressed despite himself. "Never thought I'd be taking survival lessons from someone half my size." Her dark eyes met his. "You saved me from the tree," she said. "But now, I help save you." As they filled canteens with the precious water, Luke glanced at the horizon. A thin line of gold announced the coming dawn. He felt the weight of his Winchester on his shoulder and the weight of his choices even heavier. Back at the cabin, he opened Sarah's Bible, his finger landing on a verse as if drawn by instinct. "Be strong and courageous. Do not be afraid, for the Lord your God goes with you." Deuteronomy 31:6. Luke closed the book, his jaw set. For the first time in years, he whispered a prayer. "Lord, if I'm gonna stand for something, let it be now." The first rays of dawn had barely brushed the horizon when the sound of hooves shattered the quiet. Luke was already awake, his Winchester resting across his knees, but the low thunder of approaching riders made his pulse quicken. He stood on the porch, eyes narrowed, scanning the trail. 3 figures emerged from the dust, those same bounty hunters, their shadows stretched long by the rising sun. The leader, the man with the thick mustache, grinned as if this was just another day's work. "Told you we'd be back, old man," he called out, tipping his hat. "Now, let's make this easy. Hand over the Apache girl, and maybe we'll forget this ever happened." Luke didn't move. "There's no one here but me and the cattle," he replied, his voice like gravel. The leader's grin hardened into a sneer. "You think you can lie to us? We know she's here. Saw her tracks near the creek bed. Don't test my patience." He signaled to the two men behind him, who began to fan out, circling toward the barn and the corral. Luke leveled his rifle but didn't fire. "You take another step onto this land," he said evenly, "and I'll consider it trespass." The man with the scar laughed, swinging a leg off his saddle. "Trespass? Out here? This land's as wild as the coyotes. Ain't no law but the one we bring." "Then I guess it's my law you're facing," Luke said, his tone like ice. The scarred man's hand drifted toward his revolver. That's when Luke fired not to kill, but a warning shot that split the dirt just inches from the man's boot. The horses reared, and the bounty hunters cursed. Behind the door, Nayeli crouched low, clutching her bone knife. She had seen this before, men with cruel eyes who saw her people as prey. Her heart pounded, but she didn't call out. She trusted Luke's silence and steady aim more than any words. The leader spat into the dirt. "You got guts, Thompson. Heard stories about you, Union soldier, sharpshooter at Shiloh, but that was a long time ago. You're just one old man now, with no one to back you up." Luke didn't answer. He just sighted down the barrel of his Winchester and waited. The bounty hunters backed off but didn't leave. Instead, they rode to the ridge, setting up camp just out of rifle range. Luke watched them through a gap in the shutter. "They're smart," he muttered. "They'll wait us out. Cut us off from water. Try to starve us." Nayeli's voice was quiet but firm. "Then we don't wait. We move before they do." Luke turned to her, studying her face. She wasn't afraid. If anything, there was a fierce determination in her eyes, a fire he hadn't seen in anyone for years. "You're saying we take the arroyo?" he asked. She nodded. "At night, before the moon rises, I can lead you through the canyon where horses cannot follow." Luke looked at the small cabin, the place he'd built with Sarah, the place where he buried his grief. Leaving it behind felt like ripping out part of himself, but he knew staying would get them both killed. He loaded the rifle and strapped on his knife. "All right," he said. "We move tonight." Night fell like a black curtain over the desert, and with it came a silence so deep it hummed in Luke's ears. The bounty hunters' campfires glowed faintly on the ridge, distant but watchful. Luke and Nayeli moved quietly, packing only what they could carry: canteens, dried meat, a coil of rope, and his Winchester, with a handful of cartridges. He paused for a moment on the cabin's threshold, letting his hand rest against the weathered doorframe. It was Sarah's house as much as his, the place they'd once dreamed of filling with laughter. Now, it stood empty, except for memories and shadows. "We'll come back," he muttered to himself, though he wasn't sure if he believed it. Nayeli touched his arm gently. "The desert will guide us if we listen," she whispered. They slipped into the darkness, keeping low and silent. Nayeli moved with the ease of someone who knew how to read the land. She pointed out safe paths through the brush, where the ground would leave no clear tracks. Luke followed her lead, impressed despite his years of frontier experience. The arroyo lay about half a mile west, a dry riverbed choked with pale stones and brittle sage. By the time they reached it, the moon had started to rise, a silver coin peeking over the horizon. "Down here," Nayeli said softly, sliding down the embankment. Luke followed, the gravel shifting beneath his boots. Not long after they left the cabin, the first shot echoed in the distance. Luke froze, listening. The bounty hunters had discovered their absence. A distant shout, followed by the pounding of hooves, carried across the desert. "They're coming," Luke muttered. Nayeli crouched low, her eyes glinting in the moonlight. "We must stay in the shadows. The arroyo will hide us until the cliffs narrow. Then they cannot ride their horses in." Luke nodded, gripping the Winchester. He could hear his heart beating in his ears. He wasn't afraid of a five seen worse during the war, but this was different. This wasn't about revenge or orders. It was about keeping someone alive who'd been thrown to the wolves. They followed the arroyo until the walls rose higher on each side, forming a natural canyon of stone. The path twisted sharply, and Luke realized why Nayeli had chosen it. Anyone following would have to come on foot, single file. "Smart," he said under his breath. Nayeli didn't respond. She was listening, her head tilted like a coyote sensing danger. Suddenly she whispered, "Stop." Luke halted. A faint scrape of rock echoed behind them. Then another. Someone was already in the arroyo. Luke motioned for Nayeli to climb a ledge where the canyon wall jutted out. She moved quickly and silently, her small frame almost invisible against the rock. Luke crouched near a boulder, rifle ready. The first bounty hunter came into view, the scarred man from earlier, his pistol drawn. He didn't see Luke until it was too late. "Don't take another step," Luke barked, his voice cutting through the still night. The man froze, eyes narrowing. "You think you can hold us off forever, Thompson?" "I don't need forever," Luke replied. "Just long enough to send you back down this trail without her." The scarred man backed away, but Luke knew it wouldn't end here. More riders would be coming on foot. "We need to keep moving," Luke said, helping Nayeli down from the ledge. As they continued deeper into the canyon, the stars overhead burned cold and sharp, like distant watchful eyes. The desert wasn't done testing them, not by a long shot. The canyon narrowed to a knife's edge, forcing Luke and Nayeli to slow their pace. The walls rose, steep and jagged, etched by centuries of flash floods. Luke scanned the ground for tracks, noting that the soft sand here would betray their path if they weren't careful. He turned to Nayeli, his breath steady but low. "We can't outrun them. We need to outthink them," he said. Nayeli nodded, her dark eyes reflecting the moonlight. "This place," she whispered, "it's like my home. The rocks will protect us if we use them well. We can vanish here." Luke studied the terrain. A bend in the arroyo, where the canyon wall formed a narrow choke point. A perfect place to ambush anyone foolish enough to follow. They worked quickly, but quietly. Luke gathered dry brush and stacked it behind a boulder, creating a makeshift barricade. Nayeli, agile and sure-footed, scaled a side ledge to place stones that could be rolled down if needed. Luke loaded his Winchester, the familiar weight steadying him. Every click of the lever action felt like an old friend waking from sleep. He took a breath, scanning the stars overhead. Somewhere out there, his wife's Bible verse echoed in his mind. "The Lord is my rock and my fortress. In him will I trust." Psalm 18:2. This time, the words didn't feel distant. They felt like armor. Near midnight, the sound of footsteps and hushed voices reached them. The bounty hunters had left their horses and were moving on foot through the canyon. Luke counted 3, maybe 4. The leader's voice carried, sharp and mocking. "Thompson, you think you can play war with us? Hand over the girl, and maybe we'll let you live to see another sunrise." Luke crouched behind his barricade, whispering to Nayeli, "Stay up on that ledge. Don't move unless I say." She nodded silently, gripping her bone knife. Luke waited until the first silhouette crossed into the choke point. His rifle barked once, the shot echoing like thunder between the canyon walls. The bullet struck a rock near the man's feet, sending sparks. A warning. The leader cursed, his men scattering for cover. "You think you're clever, old man. We've been hunting Apaches longer than you've been breathing." Luke's jaw tightened. "Then you should have learned when to quit." As the tension built, Luke felt the old fear trying to creep in, fear of losing, fear of failing like he had with his family. But Nayeli's voice from the ledge cut through the darkness, calm and certain. "My people say the desert tests the heart. It shows who you truly are." Luke glanced up at her, a silent acknowledgement passing between them. For the first time in years, he felt a Livanot because he was fighting, but because this fight mattered. The bounty hunters regrouped, preparing for a full assault at dawn. Luke knew they wouldn't leave without blood. He looked at Nayeli, and then at the narrow pass ahead. "Tomorrow," he said, "we end this, one way or another." The desert wind rose, swirling sand around them like ghosts. The canyon had become both their refuge and their battlefield. And as Luke tightened his grip on the rifle, he felt the weight of destiny pressing close. This was the moment that would decide not just their survival, but who he was meant to be. If you found this helpful, A quick like really helps us keep creating. Dawn crept into the canyon like a silent predator, staining the rock walls gold and crimson. Luke sat with his back against the cold stone, Winchester resting across his knees, every muscle tense. Beside him, Nayeli crouched on the ledge, her hair tousled by the dry morning wind. She held her bone knife tightly, her eyes fixed on the bend in the arroyo where the bounty hunters would appear. The sound came first gravel crunching under boots, the low hiss of men whispering. Then, as the first rays of sun lit the canyon, 3 figures emerged from the shadows. The leader, with his thick mustache and cruel grin, raised a hand, signaling his men to spread out. The scarred man carried a rifle, the third a younger outlaw, with a bandana around his neck, held a coiled lasso, as if this were just another cattle drive. "Thompson!" The leader's voice rang out, echoing off the canyon walls. "We can do this the hard way, or the harder way. You hand over the Apache girl, and we ride out. No one needs to bleed today." Luke's voice came back, steady and deep. "You had your chance to leave. You crossed that line when you came hunting her." The leader chuckled. "Old man, you don't even know who you're protecting. That girl's a troublemaker, a witness to things she's got no business talking about. We're just cleaning up messes the army doesn't want to deal with." The scarred man took a step too close. Luke fired, the shot slamming into the dirt a foot from the man's boots, sending up a spray of sand and stone. "That's your last warning," Luke growled. The younger outlaw raised his rifle. Nayeli's voice cut through the rising tension. "Luke, left side." He pivoted just as the man fired, the bullet ricocheting off the canyon wall inches from his head. Luke dropped flat, rolled behind a boulder, and returned fire, the sharp crack of his Winchester filling the canyon. The leader shouted to his men, "Pin him down, move around the flank." From her perch, Nayeli hurled a rock with all her strength, striking the young outlaw square in the shoulder. He stumbled, cursing, giving Luke the opening he needed. Another shot rang out, this one grazing the man's hat and sending it spinning. "You fight like a ghost, girl," the scarred man shouted up at Nayeli. "We'll smoke you out yet." Luke's voice cut across the canyon, rough and certain. "You want her. You'll have to go through me. And I don't plan on dying easy." As the sun climbed higher, the canyon became a furnace of heat and tension. The bounty hunters regrouped, whispering to each other, plotting their next move. Luke wiped sweat from his brow, his breathing steady but heavy. This wasn't just a standoff anymore. This was the beginning of the fight that would decide everything. Nayeli crouched beside him now, her voice barely above a whisper. "They won't stop, Luke, not until one of us is gone." Luke met her gaze, and for a moment, the world narrowed to just the two of them and the raw determination in their eyes. "Then we make sure it isn't us," he said. He chambered another round. "Stay close. Dawn's just getting started." The canyon erupted into chaos. The bounty hunters split, one circling left behind a jagged rock outcrop, another climbing a loose gravel slope to flank them. Luke ducked behind a boulder, the air sharp with the smell of gunpowder. He had 5 rounds left in his Winchester and a single revolver at his side. Nayeli crouched above, her eyes scanning every shadow. "One is moving right," she whispered, pointing to a sliver of movement across the canyon wall. Luke nodded. He rose, aimed, and fired. The shot shattered a rock inches from the scarred man's head, forcing him to dive for cover. "Keep him busy," Luke said, his voice calm despite the storm in his chest. Suddenly, a figure appeared around the canyon, Ben the younger outlaw, lasso in hand, creeping low. Nayeli spotted him first. With a sharp cry, she hurled another rock, hitting his forearm. He cursed, swinging the rope wildly and losing his balance. Luke seized the moment, stepping out from behind cover, his shot cracked like thunder, kicking up dust at the man's feet. "Drop it," Luke barked. The outlaw hesitated, his eyes flicking between Luke's rifle and the girl perched like a hawk on the ledge above. "You're protecting her? She's nothing but trouble, old man," he spat. "Funny thing," Luke replied, his tone ice cold. So am I. The leader, seeing his men pinned, shouted orders. Push in. He can't cover all of us. He grabbed his revolver and charged forward, firing twice. The bullets ricocheted off the canyon wall, chips of stone raining down. Nayeli leaped down from her ledge, landing beside Luke. We can't let them trap us here, she said quickly. The arroyo splits ahead. I can lead you through the narrow way if we hold them long enough. Luke's gaze flicked to her, surprised by her fearlessness. You sure about this? She nodded. The desert is my home. They don't know its secrets like I do. The scarred man opened fire, forcing Luke and Nayeli to duck behind the boulder. The air vibrated with each shot. Luke reloaded, counting the seconds between the outlaws' movements. They'll run out of bullets before we run out of rocks, Nayeli said, a flicker of a smile touching her lips. Luke couldn't help but grin despite the danger. You're something else, girl. The leader tried to close the distance, creeping along the right wall. Luke spotted him in the corner of his eye. Without thinking, he shoved Nayeli toward cover. Stay down, he barked, stepping into the open. His shot rang out, the bullet slamming into the rock inches from the leader's face. The man froze, cursing, and backed away. For a moment, the canyon went quiet, except for the echo of gunfire. The hunters were regrouping. Luke could feel it, their patience thinning, their anger rising. They'll charge next, Luke muttered. We need to move before they do. Nayeli pointed deeper into the arroyo. There's a split up ahead. If we can reach it, they'll lose us. Luke nodded. On my mark, we run. Luke peered around the boulder, calculating the distance to the arroyo's split 30 yards of open ground, exposed to fire. We move now, he said, his voice low but firm. Stay close and don't stop. Nayeli's jaw tightened, but she nodded. She slid the bone knife into her belt, crouching like a coiled spring. Luke took a deep breath, the familiar calm before danger settling into his bones. Go. They broke from cover, sprinting low across the open sand. Almost immediately, shots cracked behind them. A bullet zinged past Luke's shoulder, embedding itself into the canyon wall with a sharp spark. He didn't look back. Nayeli moved with surprising speed, her moccasins barely kicking up dust. Keep going, Luke barked, firing a quick shot over his shoulder to buy them seconds. The leader roared. After them. The scarred man and the younger outlaw surged forward, closing the distance. Just as Luke and Nayeli reached the canyon's narrow split, the scarred man lunged. Luke turned in time to block the blow of a rifle butt with his forearm, pain jolting through him. The Winchester slipped from his grip, clattering onto the rocks. The scarred man grinned, teeth yellowed, and swung again. Luke caught his arm, twisting hard. They grappled, boots grinding into the sand. The man was younger, stronger, but Luke's grit was forged from years of survival. He slammed his forehead into the man's nose. There was a crunch and a howl of pain. Behind them, the younger outlaw grabbed Nayeli's arm, trying to drag her away. She twisted, the bone knife flashing in the sun. The blade sliced across his forearm, forcing him to let go with a curse. She drove her shoulder into his gut, shoving him back against the rocks. Luke saw her struggling and roared, tackling the scarred man to the ground. Sand and blood mixed under their fists as they rolled. Luke's breath came in harsh grunts. He wasn't fighting just for himself. He was fighting for Sarah, for Mary, for every soul he'd failed to save. The leader raised his revolver, aiming for Luke. Before he could fire, Nayeli hurled a rock with all her strength. It struck the man's wrist, knocking the gun from his hand. Luke seized the moment, driving his elbow into the scarred man's ribs and shoving him into the dirt. He scrambled to his Winchester, swinging it up with steady aim. The leader froze, hands half raised. "Pick up that gun, and you won't walk out of this canyon," Luke growled, his voice like stone. The scarred man staggered to his feet, clutching his bleeding nose, but didn't move closer. "Move," Luke hissed to Nayeli, backing toward the canyon's split while keeping the rifle trained on the outlaws. She slipped past him, eyes never leaving the men. As they disappeared into the narrow passage, Luke glanced back one last time. The bounty hunters weren't done yet. He could see it in their eyes. The chase would continue. But for now, they had space. They had a chance. The canyon split into two path zones, narrow and twisting, the other leading to a bowl-shaped hollow surrounded by sheer cliffs. Luke guided Nayeli toward the hollow, his boots kicking loose gravel, each sound amplified by the stillness. Here, the walls closed in like the ribs of a giant beast, offering no way forward and no easy retreat. "This is where we finish it," Luke said, scanning the terrain. "We make our stand here." Nayeli's eyes flicked around the hollow. "You're certain?" Luke gave a tight nod. "If we keep running, they'll pick us off. We fight on our ground, not theirs." Luke quickly went to work. He overturned flat stones to create makeshift barricades and piled smaller rocks that could be rolled down from a high ledge. His hands moved with practiced precision. This was no different from setting a defensive perimeter back in his army days. Nayeli, agile as a mountain cat, climbed the ledges and tested footholds. "We can trap them here," she said, pointing to a slope of loose shale. "If they come charging, one push and the rocks will fall like thunder." Luke couldn't help but glance at her with quiet respect. "You've done this before?" "Not this way," she said. "But my people learned long ago that the desert doesn't forgive fools. We listen to the land, and it helps us survive." As he secured the Winchester behind a stone outcrop, Luke's gaze fell on his left hand, the scar from a Civil War bayonet, still pale against his sun-worn skin. He remembered Sarah's words during those dark days. God works through those willing to stand for what's right, even when they're afraid. He swallowed hard. "Lord, if this is my trial, give me the strength to see it through." A distant shout echoed through the canyon. Luke climbed to a ledge, peering down the twisting path. The bounty hunters were coming slower now, cautious after their last encounter. The leader's voice rang out, cold and sharp. "Thompson, you can't hide forever. The girl's got a price on her head, and we'll collect one way or another. Walk out now, and maybe we'll let you keep breathing." Luke shouted back, his voice booming through the hollow. "You picked the wrong canyon, friend. Come any closer, and you'll find out how hard it is to take something that doesn't belong to you." The words hung in the air like the crack of a whip. Luke turned to Nayeli, his face etched with determination. "When they push in, we use the rocks first. I'll draw them out with the rifle. If it comes to close range—" He glanced at her knife. She gripped it tightly, her dark eyes unwavering. "We will not fall today." For a moment, there was silence, broken only by the whisper of the desert wind through the rocks. Luke felt something shift inside him, a fierce clarity, a sense of purpose he hadn't known since the day Sarah died. "Stay close, girl," he said softly. "This is where we stand our ground." The morning sun crept over the cliffs, cutting the hollow with shafts of gold. Luke crouched behind his stone barricade, his Winchester steady in his hands. Nayeli was above him on the ledge, fingers poised over the loose rocks they'd prepared to send crashing down. The silence broke with the sharp echo of a voice. "This is your last chance, Thompson," the leader shouted, his tone like steel scraping stone. "Step aside, and we'll make it quick. No need for both of you to die out here." Luke answered with the unmistakable sound of a rifle bolt sliding home. "You'll have to go through me." The bounty hunters advanced, their boots crunching over the gravel. The scarred man took point, his revolver raised. Luke waited until they stepped into the narrow throat of the hollow, then fired. The shot kicked up dirt at their feet, sending them diving for cover. "Now!" Luke shouted. Nayeli pushed hard against the shale pile. Rocks tumbled, clattering and bouncing down the slope like a sudden storm. One struck the younger outlaw's shoulder, knocking him flat with a cry. The leader snarled, firing blindly toward the ledges. "You think that'll stop us?" Luke leaned out from cover, aiming carefully. The next shot hit the scarred man's rifle, splintering the wood and sending it spinning from his hands. "One down," Luke muttered. The younger outlaw, bleeding from his arm, scrambled to his feet and charged up the slope toward Nayeli. She met him head-on, her bone knife flashing in the sunlight. He grabbed her wrist, but she twisted like a wildcat, kicking his knee out from under him. He howled and stumbled, giving Luke the chance to fire another warning shot that pinned the leader behind a rock. "Fall back!" the scarred man yelled, but the leader ignored him. Rage burned in his eyes as he rose, revolver aimed at Luke. Time seemed to slow. Luke could see every detail, the glint of sunlight on the gun barrel, the sneer curling the man's lips, and the ghost of Sarah's face in his memory, whispering, "Protect the innocent." Luke didn't hesitate. He squeezed the trigger. The leader's revolver flew from his hand as the bullet struck, sending him crashing to his knees, clutching his shoulder. The canyon went silent except for the labored breathing of the defeated men. Luke advanced slowly, rifle still aimed. "It's over," he said, his voice low but unwavering. "You ride out now, or you don't ride at all." The scarred man hauled the younger outlaw to his feet. He glared at Luke, but didn't reach for his weapon. "This ain't the end, Thompson," he growled. "It is for today," Luke replied. "Now get out." The men backed out of the hollow, dragging their leader with them. Luke waited until they vanished beyond the canyon bend, then lowered his rifle, his arms trembling from the adrenaline. Nayeli climbed down from the ledge, her breath ragged but her eyes steady. "You stood like a warrior," she said quietly. Luke looked at her, a slow exhale escaping his chest. "Number, I just stood where I should have all along." Luke stood in the hollow's center, rifle still hot in his hands. His breath came hard, but his eyes stayed sharp as the bounty hunters limped away. The leader bleeding from his shoulder turned once to glare at him, hate and disbelief etched across his weathered face. "You could finish it right now," Nayeli said softly, watching Luke. "End them before they come back." Luke's finger hovered near the trigger. He had every reason to put these men down, to make sure they never hurt anyone again. But then he remembered Sarah's words spoken years ago as she read her Bible by firelight. "Vengeance is mine, I will repay, says the Lord." Romans 12:19. Luke's shoulders loosened. "No," he said finally. "Killing them makes me no better. They'll face judgment, one way or another, just not by my hand." He lowered the rifle and knelt, resting his hand against the dusty earth. The sun had climbed high now, spilling light into every corner of the canyon. Luke closed his eyes, whispering a prayer he hadn't spoken in years. "Lord, I don't know if I've been the man I should have been, but today, thank you for the strength to protect what's right." Nayeli stood quietly, watching him with an expression of respect. "Among my people," she said, "mercy is strength. You chose the harder path." Luke gave a faint smile. "Guess I still got something to learn." As they gathered their things to leave the hollow, Luke glanced at the ground where the leader had fallen. The man's revolver lay half buried in the dust. For a moment, Luke considered taking it another weapon for survival, but he left it there. It felt wrong to carry the instrument of another man's hatred. "Where do we go now?" Nayeli asked as she adjusted the strap on her small satchel. Luke scanned the horizon. "Back to the cabin. We'll regroup, gather what we need. Then I'll see you safely out of this territory. You've got a story the world needs to hear." As they walked through the winding arroyo, the echoes of gunfire faded, replaced by the whispers of wind. Luke felt something inside him ease for the first time in years. He wasn't just surviving anymore, he was standing for something. At one point, Nayeli paused and knelt, pressing her palm against the warm desert sand. She murmured a few words in Apache, a prayer of gratitude to the spirits of the land. Luke waited, hat in hand, sensing the sacredness of the moment. When she stood, she looked at him with a soft smile. "The desert will remember this day," she said. By the time they reached the mouth of the canyon, the sun was blazing overhead. Luke turned one last time, looking back at the battlefield. The place where fear had nearly broken him now felt like holy ground, a place where his past and his faith had collided, and something stronger had risen from the dust. "Let's go," he said, tipping his hat low against the sun. "We've got a future to find." If you're still watching right now, drop a 1 in the comments so I know you're still with me on this journey. The cabin stood as they'd left it, weathered, silent, and smelling of sun-baked wood. Yet something felt different when Luke and Nayeli stepped through the door. The old loneliness that once filled this place like dust had lifted, replaced by the quiet strength of two survivors who had stood together against death. Luke set his Winchester on the table and removed his hat, running a hand through his graying hair. He glanced around at the simple room. Sarah's Bible still lay open where he'd last read it, and the sight of it stirred a warmth in his chest instead of pain. "You need rest," Luke said, nodding toward the cot. "Your body's been through hell." Nayeli smiled faintly. "We both need rest." As evening settled over the desert, Luke stepped outside, leaning against the porch rail. The horizon stretched wide and endless, glowing orange as the sun sank. He thought about the men who had come hunting them, and the blood-soaked stories they carried. They might return with more firepower, but Luke no longer felt the gnawing fear of being alone. Inside, Nayeli studied Sarah's Bible, running her fingers over the worn leather cover. "Your wife read this often?" she asked softly when Luke came back in. "Every night," Luke replied, his voice low. "She believed God works in mysterious ways. Even when life breaks you down, He's still there, shaping something better." Nayeli nodded. "Among my people, we say the land shapes us the same way. The storms, the droughts, even the hunger, they test us, but they make us stronger if we endure." Their words fell into the kind of silence that felt full instead of empty. Luke knew he couldn't keep Nayeli here forever. The bounty hunters might retreat for now, but word would spread. She needed to find her people, or at least a place where her voice and the truth of Skeleton Canyon could be heard. "I'll take you as far as Tucson," Luke said. "There's a pastor there, Reverend Miller, a good man. He'll help you get safe passage and maybe speak your truth." "Oh?" Nayeli studied him, her eyes deep and unreadable. "And you? What will you do?" Luke glanced around the cabin once more. "Maybe it's time I stop hiding in this patch of dust. Maybe God's not finished with me yet." The next morning dawned quiet, painted with soft pink light. Luke saddled Rusty, loading the saddlebags with dried meat, a water skin, and a wool blanket. Nayeli watched him work, her slender hands clutching her satchel. There was no fear on her face, now only resolve, as though the fire of the past days had forged her into something unshakable. "You're sure about this?" Luke asked, tightening the cinch strap. Nayeli nodded. "I cannot hide forever. My people, they need someone to tell the truth of what happened in Skeleton Canyon. If I keep silent, then the dead will have no voice." Luke admired her courage. "Most folks spend their whole lives running from the truth. You're walking straight into it." Before she mounted Rusty, Nayeli pressed something into Luke's hand, her necklace of carved bone depicting white-painted woman. "In our stories," she said, "she gave life to our people and taught us how to endure. I carried her to remember who I was. But now, I think you should have her." Luke stared at the necklace, humbled. "I can't take this. It's part of you." Nayeli shook her head. "You saved me, Luke. But more than that, you stood for what is right. You found your strength again." White-painted woman would be proud. For a long moment, Luke said nothing. Then he fastened the necklace around his wrist like a token. "I'll carry it then, not as mine, but as a promise." As Nayeli mounted the horse, Luke placed his hand on Rusty's neck. "There's a trail west that'll take you to the Santa Cruz River. Follow it south, and you'll hit Tucson by sundown tomorrow." Nayeli looked down at him, her dark eyes gleaming in the morning light. "I will never forget this place," she said. "Or you." Luke tipped his hat, his voice rough. "Go with God, Nayeli, and with your ancestors." She smiled faintly, then rode off into the rising sun, her figure becoming a silhouette against the desert horizon. Luke watched until she vanished, a strange ache settling in his chest, a mix of sorrow and hope. The cabin felt different after Nayeli's departure, quiet, but no longer hollow. Luke stood by the porch, watching the dust trail where she had vanished, and for the first time in years, the silence didn't feel like a burden. It felt like peace. He walked back inside, his hand brushing Sarah's Bible on the table. He opened it to a page she had once marked with her delicate handwriting. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it. John 1-5. Luke smiled faintly, the weight in his chest lifting. He wasn't the man who hid from the world anymore. Somewhere out there, Nayeli was riding toward her future, carrying the truth of Skeleton Canyon, and he had helped her find that road. Stepping outside, Luke gazed across the Dragoon Mountains. The land was still wild and untamed, holding the scars of blood and history. He thought of the stories the desert kept off men and women who fought not just for survival but for dignity, for faith, and for each other. This land, he murmured, it breaks you, but it also makes you whole if you let it. He touched the bone-carved pendant on his wrist. It wasn't just a keepsake, it was a reminder that strength isn't in standing alone, but in standing for something greater. Luke spent that evening repairing the cabin roof and tending to Rusty. The world outside might still hold danger, but his spirit was steady, renewed. That night, as the stars blanketed the desert sky, he whispered a prayer of thanks for Nayeli, for Sarah and Mary's memory, and for the strange way God had led him back to life. The story of Luke and Nayeli isn't just a tale of survival, it's a piece of the true Wild West stories that remind us what courage and faith looked like on the frontier. It's about mercy where vengeance could have ruled, and about finding hope in the harshest of places. If stories like these stir something in your heart, memories of a wilder, more honest time, join us as we share more forgotten legends of the Old West. Subscribe and keep riding with us down the trails where history still whispers.